So hello and welcome to Diaspers, a podcast and YouTube channel that explores current events, pop culture, and public history on a local and global level. My name is Daesun Oka, and I'm a Cold War historian. I focus mostly on post-World War II political memory and Zainichi, Korean, and racial justice issues in Asia America.
And I'm Rebecca Pierce. I'm a documentary filmmaker and a writer, and I focus on human rights and racial justice issues from the U.S. to Israel and Palestine.
In today's episode, our guest is Brian Hioe. Brian is one of the founders and editors of New Bloom magazine, an online magazine covering activism and youth politics in Taiwan and Asia Pacific. Brian brings in a crucial voice to Taiwan in a time of geopolitical uncertainty around the world, and especially Asia Pacific with the rise of China and the continued militarization of the United States. The island nation of Taiwan, located in the Western Pacific, just 100 miles off the coast of China, has long been caught between competing economic and military powers, subjected to both Dutch and Japanese colonialism and the Chinese nationalist invasion in 1949, and today treated as a geopolitical bargaining chip in the U.S. China trade war. Taiwan's history and people are rarely discussed on their own terms. Even less discussed are the Taiwanese Aboriginal communities excluded from political discourse surrounding settlement of settlement of Taiwan. My guest here, Brian, brings in that crucial voice I think we desperately need to hear. So I'll leave it to Brian to fill in a lot of the history that we should familiarize ourselves with first before we dive into the contemporary politics of Taiwan. So Brian, can you provide a brief summary of Taiwanese history? What empires and states have controlled Taiwan? And who comprise the people of Taiwan?
That's right. So Taiwan was originally settled by indigenous groups that have been there for thousands of years. But in terms of its more modern history, you can trace that back to maybe 400 years ago, when the Han settlement of Taiwan started happening, when there's migration from China. And so then Taiwan was not actually always thought of as part of the Chinese empires that existed, the Ming and the Qing dynasties, but it was sometimes incorporated into it. It was seen as a kind of remote, barbaric wasteland. However, then in 1895, following the Sino-Japanese War between Japan, the kind of newly arisen Japanese empire, and China, Taiwan is then ceded to Japan as a colonial possession. And so this becomes Japan's first colony, test-bed colony, in preparation for later colonialism. And so then after that follows a 50-year colonial period. And during that time, Taiwan was modernized, the railroad system as well, so there was an education system. And then after those 50 years, following World War II, Taiwan is then given to the control of the ROC, the Republic of China. And this is the KMT version of China. The KMT is the Chinese Nationalist Party, which fought with the Chinese Communist Party for control of the Chinese mainland. And the Chinese Nationalist Party, the KMT, lost, and so it came to Taiwan, inheriting basically the Japanese colonial Taiwan, and sought to quote-unquote re-Sinicize Taiwan to make it Chinese again. But this was not something that the kind of residents that had gone through the Japanese colonial period and had been there for 100 years were particularly welcoming of, because of the fact that, for example, they brought up around, the KMT, they brought up around 10% of the population, whereas 90% of the population had been there originally, around 88% of Han descent from earlier settlement, or 2% indigenous. And so then they made people kind of unlearn Japanese. They banned the speaking of Taiwanese Hokkien and indigenous languages in favor of Mandarin. And they carried out a brutal white terror, took down intellectuals, people that had been educated in the Japanese period that could resist their rule, people that were leftists, for example, either through influence from Japanese Marxism or Chinese Marxism, pre-Maoist sometimes. And so that led to the White Terror period, which was once the longest martial law period in the world. But then Taiwan democratized in the 1980s and the 1990s because of struggles from people's movements, the democracy movement and the movement to create a second party outside of the KMT, which eventually led to the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party, which is a more independence-leaning, more progressive party that is currently in power. Eventually, once democratic elections started happening, it was able to win power. Though it's only fairly recently that they actually won control of the legislature for the first time. So it was not until 2016 that actually the legislature was not controlled by the KMT. So there's been a gradual progress for democratization in Taiwan.
Great, thank you. And to clarify one point, you mentioned that the DPP, along with them being kind of the pro-democracy and the party of labor, they were also the party of pro-independence. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Like, what is independence politics in Taiwan? why are the DPP for it, and why is the KMT in favor of not independence, or in other words, unification?
It's actually one of the very interesting phenomena, I think, of Taiwanese history, because the KMT came from China after being defeated by the Chinese Communist Party. But then as the decades went on, once it realized that it would no longer have any capacity to militarily reconquest China, to defeat the Chinese Communist Party and retake China, it became more open to the idea of unification on the current grounds of basically Taiwan becoming part of China under the CCP in some form, because of the fact that it was just impossible for them to actually control China again. So they were actually just happy to have unification in any form. And the DPP is a party that was historically stronger in terms of being pro-independence, independence activists that call for Taiwan to be independent from China, as well as from just the KMT and their version of China that they tried to create on Taiwan. The party has kind of backed away from being as radical as in the past and as strong on the independence issue as in the past, because of just once you take power, you do become more conservative. But historically, it was the party that is in support of Taiwanese independence, or maintaining the kind of existing status quo in which Taiwan is independent of China, though it is not recognized by the majority of the world's countries as independent.
To summarize pretty much briefly what you all said over the past 100, to summarize the past 100 years of Taiwanese history, there was the first Japanese colonialism after 1890s, and Taiwan was a part of the Japanese Empire. And what you're saying now is that after Taiwan became liberated from Japan, it didn't really become its own polity, but rather the KMT came in. Is that right?
That's right. Yes. Okay. And so oftentimes advocates of Taiwanese identity or independence will view Taiwan as having faced successive colonial regimes. And I think that's the case, yeah. First, the Hans are actually also a colonial regime when it comes to indigenous, but then you have, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, then the Japanese, and then the KMT. And so that kind of raises that Taiwan is, there's one scholar that phrased it as a land born of colonialism, in that sense, that there have been so many successive ways of colonialism. This has been what Taiwanese identity has emerged out of, actually.
Interesting, thank you. Can you tell me, what was rule like in Taiwan under the KMT, and what changed?
So it's one of those interesting things, actually, because compared to other parts of East Asia or the Asia Pacific, there's a romanticization of the Japanese colonial period, because the KMT, when they came, it's viewed as worse. So the Japanese did modernize Taiwan. They built up the education system and infrastructure. But then the KMT came and they kind of tried to use Taiwan as a base to go back to China. And so this involved a lot of resource extraction, not really having the long-term concerns of Taiwan in mind. There were political purges conducted. Tens of thousands were killed in the White Terror. There's the 228 massacre. That's a major incident in which the KMT just put down and executed intellectuals and political dissidents, people that were kind of active during the Japanese colonial period politically, just to crush resistance. And then after that, just ruling over Taiwan in the decades that followed, one saw spectacular economic growth during the time of the economic miracle. And one sees this in other Asia Pacific countries, or East Asian countries specifically. And part of it's actually just because of massive American subsidies that allowed for Taiwan's economic growth. But then because of economic growth, then that occurs simultaneously with this rising call for democracy, because just there was increasing amount of contact, for example, of Taiwanese with the international world. There were Taiwanese going abroad studying and learning about, for example, the banned history of Taiwan, that these incidents did occur, such as the 228 massacre, that there were these political purges going down, that people were being denied access to certain ideas or freedom of the speech and thought, and political mobilization was denied to them. And so that eventually led to, the democracy movement. But yeah, it's one of those things that I think that Taiwan fits the pattern of right-wing dictators backed by America in order to counter a quote-unquote communist country. And for so long, there was economic growth that allowed for, a kind of political credibility to bank political legitimacy on being able to grow the economy. But yeah, just initially when the KMT came, though, that wasn't the case. And the KMT is viewed as just kind of not knowing how to govern Taiwan and being very ineffective and just, putting down people by force.
Great, thank you. Tell me a little bit about the people who challenged the KMT. Who are these people? What are their demands? And specifically, what are their demands when it comes to Taiwanese democracy and independence?
So it's actually one of the very interesting things that I think when we look at this history, a lot of it gets framed in retrospectively. So for example, the DPP is seen as a party that's leaning more towards independence, and it is a party that came out of the Zhangwai movement, the democracy movement, and the Zhangwai means like the forming a second party, a second political party.
Mhm.
But to begin with, the DPP it was originally an alliance of disparate political forces that were united by their opposition to the KMT, and so that it has both left wing and a right wing in the party, and it's actually it could be two parties if it were kind of a more normal political system in which you didn't still have this former authoritarian party still around. But then, like you have the split between, for example, independence and unification actually becomes more prominent like later on, actually, in 2000 when the DPP takes power for the first time. Is you have a split between, let's say, the pro-independence left and the pro-unification left. And that's kind of a newer split. But in terms of the people that constitute the DPP, I mean, there's a large swath of society. So there's intellectuals and also workers and people like that. The DPP was closer to workers because just the KMT is quite exploitative. It also there were unions that were more KMT affiliated, for example, but they were used as a system of political control in companies and a way of kind of achieving growth benchmarks, actually, just monitoring companies internally to make sure they're meeting their benchmarks. So union groups do favor the DPP more in that sense. But then, some of the leaders are intellectuals, lawyers, people that became activists after being students, and a lot more people that studied abroad as well, because I think particularly during their time as part of the diaspora, that allowed them, again, like I said, just to come into contact with banned books. For example, Foremost Betrayed is a book that's really frequently cited, which was written about the 228 massacre. And so just being able to read that. And there's also monitoring of overseas students by the KMT, but people did come back and they became leaders in the movement and so forth. And so there's kind of interesting history there. Yeah.
So Brian, I'm very curious about your own work and kind of your own personal journey. In 2014, you said that you were involved with the Sunflower Student Movement, which was a movement against the KMT's attempts to sign a free trade agreement with the People's Republic of China. Tell us about this movement, what it was fighting against, and what it was trying to strive for in Taiwan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the Sunflower Movement broke out in March 2014, and that involved the month-long occupation of the Taiwanese legislature by student activists. And this was in protest of a free trade agreement that the Ma administration, which was a KMT administration, it was the first time the KMT came back to power after the democratization. The Ma period saw what many perceived as kind of a slide back to authoritarianism. Just that there were restrictions on political freedom of speech put in place when, for example, you had Chinese diplomats coming to Taiwan. And you saw the Want Group, for example, this large media conglomerate buying up media is referred to as media monopoly. It was trying to buy up media outlets to actually control the messaging that was present about China in Taiwan, just to create positive perceptions of China and to pass over any authoritarian actions that took place internally regarding oppression of domestic dissent and that kind of thing. And so there have been a lot of protests in the years before just about various issues, such as the media monopoly issue. This was also a period that saw a lot of evictions, for example, of elderly in poor districts, for example. There were a lot of just the economic inequality was getting worse. And there's also issues such as nuclear energy that the Ma administration seemed so intent on pushing nuclear energy, despite the fact that there's a very poor track record when it came to that, just in terms of that seismic activity in Taiwan could lead to potentially nuclear disaster. But just there seemed to be very tight ties between the Ma administration and the nuclear lobby. And so just like all these kind of issues came together in this one way in the form of this issue regarding the FTA. I think actually it could have just been any issue that sparked it, but it became this FTA, and it was just a kind of expression of anger against the KMT, against the Ma administration and its actions at that point in time. So for me, myself, I mean, that was right after I graduated college, I spent 20 years in the US, and then just came back to Taiwan. And so I just kind of knew, I got to know the student activists in the year before that. Just hanging around protests and going to protests, because having always been involved in activism from high school in the US, in New York specifically, and then college and experiencing Occupy Wall Street or studying abroad in Japan and experiencing the post-Fukushima anti-nuclear movement, that's after that kind of history, I ended up in Taiwan and sought to build ties with the kind of, activists there. And so I just randomly drifted into it. And I hung out with a bunch of activists that had a reading group. We met weekly, and just the movement happened, and we all sucked into it. And we ended up being people that are sucked into more kind of international outreach efforts, because we were people with better English or had spent some time abroad or whatever. And we connected between people that were diaspora in the US that wanted to plug back into what was happening on the ground in Taiwan, and people that were on the ground here in Taiwan that were seeking to outreach through the international world, and connecting these kind of two groups together. And eventually that became New Bloom, the publication, which I still run now 6 years later. And we were really founded on the attempt to actually have a more left-wing perspective on Taiwanese independence, to have a left-wing articulation of Taiwanese independence and to bank on people's movements and connections between them and establishing them rather than banking on states, such as pitting U.S. empire against Chinese empire. And now it's like 30 people. There's only a few people are active at any given time, and we're actually working on like a physical space in Taipei, just like a kind of community center or an art space, to create further space for mobilization. But yeah, it was kind of an odd journey, just ending up from being kind of politicized during growing up in America, and then just trying to do that here as well, and just getting sucked into this massive movement that just randomly happened. I was just right after coming back to Taiwan.
Wow, thank you for that explanation. Great. Let's talk about labor's relationship with the DPP and KMT. So it seems like the KMT garners a lot of legitimacy by claiming that they're the party that brought economic growth to Taiwan, albeit with a lot of American subsidies.
Yeah.
What is then the economic vision of the Taiwanese pro-democracy forces, including the DPP, and how is that different than the conservative economic politics of the KMT?
So the KMT very much in the past few years is really kind of trying to leverage on this nostalgia, saying that they will build infrastructure projects such as similar to the big infrastructure projects in the past under Cheng Kuo, and that this will develop the economy. And also the KMT is really pursuing closer economic relations with China. I think it fits with their ideology that they are the party of unification. And in the past, while that meant retaking China and displacing the CCP, now just means integration in some form. They view the CCP as amenable now. They're willing to work with them. And so the KMT tries to steer Taiwan towards, for example, signing free trade agreements with China. That's what led to the Sunflower Movement in 2014, which New Bloom came out of. Just that was a movement against an FTA to be signed with China. And there were concerns that opening Taiwan's service sector industry to China would have very large effects on freedom of speech. You would have self-censorship by companies declaring that, our workers cannot have certain ideas. I mean, this happened actually even without signing these FTAs. And there already had been effects on, for example, the media. Just that there are media that are basically censoring out news that depicts China in a negative light to create better images of China in Taiwan. And there's concerns that if this kind of economic policy continues, you'll see more of that. And so that's why there's resistance to that from pan-green forces, people that are more independence-leaning. But then in terms of alternative economic vision by the DPP or more progressive forces, it's actually still a question. The DPP, for example, has been trying to push the new southbound policy, which involves building stronger ties with Southeast Asian countries, economic, politically, culturally, whatever. But does that actually just mean becoming their economic exploiter? Because Taiwan is more economically developed than a lot of Southeast Asian countries. And it's really might just mean Taiwanese company owners shifting their factories from China to Southeast Asia, for example. And so that is actually, it's not necessarily progressive. It's possibly just an exploitative policy as well.
Interesting. So there seems to be kind of like neoliberal tendencies within the both.
Yes,
DPP
that's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Got it. So speaking of which, I want to clarify the KMT's relationship with capitalism in China. So let's get this straight. The KMT were the ones who were fighting against China, correct?
Yes.
In their civil war in mainland China. They lost in 1949, escaped to Taiwan and set up shop, established their own political economy with the backing of the United States. But then I'm kind of curious, when did this switch happen with the KMT, where they started to kind of approach China as a potential economic partner? And why did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, it happens particularly in the last 2 decades, and it's one of those mysteries too. I mean, for example, I'm from KMT family, and it's kind of remarkable watching family members that become more interested in China, have been building stronger ties with China when historically they're so anti-China. And so it plays out in a lot of very hard to explain ways when it comes to identity. You literally will have, for example, retired generals that fought against China, and their war buddies died fighting against the CCP, and now they go over and conduct meetings with the CCP, and just kind of really promote stronger ties with China in that sense. And so that's just very hard to explain from the identity. But I think that part of it is also just economic model. China eventually shifted to an economic model that was more similar to Taiwan's in that sense. And also just, I think that for a lot of members of the KMT, that's, again, the political and economic elites, their business just kind of hops between the cross-strait to begin with, that, for example, someone like Terry Goh, the owner of Foxconn, he has all these factories in China because of cheap labor and so forth. And for him, to be honest, Taiwan and China, it's all really the same. Wherever he goes, he will be an elite. And so I think for them, the way they think that they can actually benefit economically is to have stronger ties with China. But also, I think particularly because democratization happened, people in the KMT party elites view their elite privilege as under attack. And so one way to actually preserve elite privilege is to push for closer relations to China. And for one, that just in the hopes that economic growth coming out of this would allow them to have legitimacy to take power again in Taiwan, but also just I think they believe that they would benefit from the CCP rewarding them for achieving integration of Taiwan and China. And so I think it's one of those paradoxes. But I think also just it's also has to do with just the fact that regionally nobody can ignore China anymore. The rise of China is too economically large for any regional power not to do business with. And for Taiwan, compared to, for example, engaging with other countries, engaging with Southeast Asian countries, there's no language barrier, and so it's easier to do business with China. Yeah.
So, everything that you just said now, I think it demonstrates the malleability of history and memory. You can have former enemies of the CPP put aside their memories of an intense violent conflict with the CPP and then see the Chinese as a potential trading and political partner, economic and political partner. So with that said, how is Taiwanese civil society kind of reckoning with a lot of the violent histories of Taiwan, especially when the the KMT came over to Taiwan and established their own rule? What processes are happening in civil society?
Absolutely. And so actually it's still an issue that a lot of this history regarding the political actions of the KMT are not taught in schools. And so actually a lot of, young people have to learn this themselves. I mean, it's not the case that books are banned anymore, but a lot of this education occurs at college level, people seeking out things on their own, reading on their own. So young people, in particularly the years before the 2014 Sunflower Movement, there were reading groups and screenings and talks, and people would attend these. They're historical events to commemorate these kind of past historic events, such as the 228 massacre. For example, there's the largest 228 massacre commemoration event is like a yearly indie rock concert that's organized by young people. And so people are always kind of surprised that it takes the form of an indie rock concert, but that's what draws young people to an event like that, where they do learn about history and identity and that kind of thing. And so it's a process of self-education. The KMT always will make this accusation against the DPP that they're instilling this Taiwanese independence ideology in young people through various illicit means, but it's not the case. I mean, I think it's very much just the fact that young people are seeking out this knowledge of their own. I think also particularly when you get to university, you do have professors who maybe experience this period in which there was crackdowns on intellectuals, and they can kind of pass down this historical memory. The democratization movement in the 1990s, the student activists from, let's say, the 1990 Wobbly movement are now basically in their 40s, and these are people who are still around and active in civil society. They went to politics. They might run as politicians, or they might have formed NGOs or civil society organizations, and so they pass down their experiences in that way. I think that's how young people are actually kind of learning about this happening in Taiwan's very recent past, actually. And I think every family, maybe a lot of families, have stories, for example, as well.
Right. No, it's very cool. Within Taiwanese societies, there's the tendency, the cultural tendency to reconnect with China, but at the same time, concurrently and in counter to that, there's a lot of people trying to know the pre-Chinese, either KMT or Hokkien history about Taiwan. I think there's a lot of competing tendencies in Taiwan that just presents a very fascinating society.
Yeah, that's right. The KMT, there's less and less young people. That's very visible. So I think they keep trying to push the kind of China-centric narrative in which Taiwan has always just been part of China. There's never been any difference. And they try to pass over, for example, the Japanese colonial period, indigenous history, just the history of the White Terror, because it reflects badly on them, and so forth. And that's they try to push this kind of just 5,000 years of Chinese history. But yeah. I think particularly the views of young people are much more that regarding Taiwanese history that are not focused on this kind of China-centric narrative, are much more nuanced and taking account, let's say, again, like I said, indigenous history or Taiwan's Japanese colonial period, its mixed impact and the effects of the U.S. historically on Taiwan, that kind of thing.
Right. And then you mentioned 228, and that's February 28th. Is that the massacre that happened on the day?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And what was this massacre? Very quickly, just explain what happened and why is it significant?
Yeah, it was sparked by basically a inspection by the KMT colonial authorities of a cigarette seller, and it provoked a lot of backlash because ethnic discrimination by the mainlanders was becoming already visible after the KMT came over. People were dissatisfied with just how they were their ineffective governments and corruption. And just the KMT decided they'd had it, and so they just ordered political killings, and just these were the beginning of purges, and just the rivers ran red with blood in Taipei. It's depicted, for example, in City of Sadness. That's a pretty famous movie. I'd recommend that as a kind of way to jump into it. It's actually also still, just even looking at that movie is in the 1990s, and that made in the 1990s, and even that was still a taboo topic then. And so it's actually still very recent that we can talk about this. yeah, I mean, the KMT still will claim that basically just it never happened, that only a few hundred were killed, not tens of thousands. And it's still actually just kind of unclear how many were killed. It was only just in the last 2 decades that people were discovering the mass graves of people that were killed during that in Taipei, actually. And so it's actually just, you know, look closely around in history and just there's all this bloodshed that a lot of people, this is covered up by urban development, you could say.
Gotcha. So on the topic of political memory, and this is kind of where my work comes into play, I work with how Asia Pacific and the United States has confronted the legacy of Japanese imperial atrocities from the 1930s and 1940s. And a lot of scholars and political actors have cited this legacy, this historical memory, as one of the most contentious political issues in East Asia. So I'm wondering, what can you say about Taiwan's stake and contribution to this legacy and the region's attempts to come to terms with it?
So it's actually one of those very interesting things because Taiwan tends to be the kind of outlier when it comes to memories of the Japanese colonial period, that because the KMT came over and they're perceived as worse, there's this nostalgia for the Japanese colonial period. You know, for example, in Korea, you see the destruction of a lot of Japanese colonial architecture. In Taiwan, you much more see that preserved and calls to preserve it. And so then actually, you know, for example, the comfort women issue is leveraged on by the KMT as part of its Chinese nationalism. It uses this to promote, you know, just like, well, you know, Japan did all these historical atrocities and tries to feed this into its victimization narrative to build up Chinese nationalism in that respect. And so the anti-Japanese aspect is something that the KMT plays up a lot and accuses the DPP of being soft on Japanese or too pro-Japanese or brainwashing young people with pro-Japanese ideology, and perceives that actually as at the root of the rise of Taiwanese independence, actually. Because it is also true that a lot of the intellectuals that were originally involved in these kind of early independence efforts were educated in the Japanese colonial period. So there's that, but it's one of those things, actually. And so then, you know, the KMT actually has tried to really leverage on this issue. And it's very disappointing to see, actually, because then it becomes this historical atrocity from Japanese empire, from the history of Japanese nationalism. It's just used to kind of feed another form of nationalism. And the DPP, I mean, in this case, it's Chinese nationalism. In the DPP, which is more, I guess, Taiwanese nationalist leaning, will sometimes downplay this, but it's difficult in that sense. For example, there is like one museum, the Amma Museum, which is devoted to comfort women, and you know it's true that both parties, both the DPP and the KMT, will make they will go and say comments about how this is important, it has to be preserved, but then nobody's actually. I mean, the museum is at risk of shutting down right now, and so you know there's nobody that are just taking steps to preserve this history. I mean, there are some groups that are young people, but they don't really have political backing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I went to that museum last year and it was like pretty interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Small museum.
But I'm learning now from what you're saying. It's like it's also a contested site between like DPP and KMT.
That's right. Apparently. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, the KMT leverages on it pretty hard because they think this is a way to kind of boost their own ideology.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. What is the DPP strategy to continue like creating kind of historical memory and ties to the Japanese period? Is that a kind of a foreseeable future with the DPP strategy?
I think less so now. In the past, maybe. And I think in the past, particularly, it is people that did grow up during this period. And so with Tsai, for example, the rise of Tsai Ing-wen, the current president, you do see attempts to point to this 400-year history of Taiwan involving settlement by various colonial powers and so forth. I mean, Tsai is herself, for example, quarter indigenous, and she apologized to indigenous on behalf of the ROC state, which was historic. But there's still issues, for example, indigenous traditional territories have not been returned, and this is still a demand of indigenous activists. So just pointing to this kind of history, this longer history, this 400 years or 1,000 years of history in Taiwan is what Tsai, I think, is really trying to steer Taiwan's political narrative towards more. I mean, just you talk to older people that were educated under the KMT, and they actually just have no idea that Taiwan was ever colonized by the Spanish, the Dutch, or the Portuguese, that this even happened, and that kind of thing. So I think just pointing to this kind of a different, just Taiwan as kind of a hub of the Asia Pacific, as bringing together a lot of pluralistic influences from the other powers which surround it, and that's kind of the narrative Tsai is pushing. Yeah,
absolutely. No, thank you for that. I think if we have time at the end of the interview, we'd love to share our experiences of us going to Okinawa. Another site of like emerging states and empires. So
yeah, we were actually supposed to do an event in Okinawa in May. Just COVID prevented that. Just to build ties actually between Taiwan and Okinawa.
Right. Absolutely. Very necessary. This will be my last question before I give it up to Rebecca. So finally, we know that Hong Kong recently passed a national security law, effectively making legal calls for secession and subversion against the PRC. What does this law entail, and why are many Taiwanese concerned about what's happening in Hong Kong, often citing Hong Kong as a stepping stone for China on its way to Taiwan?
Mhm. Yeah, so the national security law criminalizes sedition against the Chinese government, but it's thought this will just be used to crack down on political freedoms, and it can involve up to life in jail. The other thing I was concerning too is that the way the national security law was passed is that it was just passed directly by the Chinese legislature. It was not passed through the Hong Kong legislature, and so just China's rule will supersede any pretense to there being a governmental system in Hong Kong that is independent. And so that's part of the concerns. But then generally there has been these fears for decades. In 2003, there were 6 years after the handover of Hong Kong from British control to Chinese control, there were protests against Article 23, which would have done effectively the same thing. And so there's been long concerns about China passing some kind of law through some means that would criminalize dissent or in the frame as framed as sedition or separatism, attempts to break off Hong Kong from China, and that this would be used to put down political freedoms. And so that's what happened. And has led to protests. And it's one of those interesting things because just actually this has been around as a cause for so long that any number of issues could spark the current set of protests that have gone on for longer than a year. Last year the protests were sparked directly just by proposing an extradition agreement that would have also possibly allowed for Hong Kongers to be extradited to China to face charges. And so it's concerning for Taiwan because I think Hong Kong is Taiwan's other in that sense, because Hong Kong is under Chinese political control already, but was historically not. Taiwanese project a possible vision of the future onto Hong Kong. If Taiwan falls Chinese control, it might become something similar to Hong Kong. And it's also true that, for example, the notion of one country, two systems that was used in Hong Kong for so many decades, or said it would last for so many decades, was actually formulated as a way to win Taiwan back, to lure Taiwan back into the fold and become part of China. And so I think that's part of the concern. And there actually have been Taiwanese that have also been kidnapped, just traveling to China from Hong Kong after participating in the movement over the past year. And so that's another matter of concern. And there are concerns that Taiwanese could be targeted if they are in China or if they're even just passing through China, such as transferring planes, even in Hong Kong International Airport or a Chinese airport in Beijing or Shanghai or wherever. And so I think that's also concerning.
Sure. Thank you for the explanation. So we're going to transition to more contemporary politics. I think you presented a good foundation for that. So Rebecca, if you can take away with a couple of questions that you have regarding the contemporary politics of Taiwan.
Yeah, so we're in a moment globally, really, where settler societies around the world are sort of facing a lot of indigenous resistance movements, forcing them to reckon with these legacies of colonialism. And I'm curious, you've been talking a lot about indigenous people in Taiwan. Is there any kind of similar process happening with that in Taiwan? And how are indigenous people from Taiwan factoring into the independence movement, for example?
Yeah, so it's interesting because it reflects a generational shift between, let's say, this generation of indigenous independence movement and previously. The Taiwanese independence movement historically, Taiwanese nationalist, but what nationalist is that? It's really Han nationalist. It's a form of Han nationalism. And so for indigenous, then, they will often have viewed this as kind of more of the same. Actually, it's also the case that indigenous as well as Hakka are a Chinese minority group. I'm actually Hakka. But they have historically voted KMT just because they are wary of the DPP, what they perceive as DPP ethno-nationalism for a bunch of China. And also just sometimes I think oppressed groups will vote for the oppressor because of the fact that they prefer stability. And particularly where China is concerned, I think some people just do prefer stability and they view the KMT as more stable. But it's one of those issues where I think there has actually not been widespread discussion of it in the same way as in other contexts, such as North America, Canada, in the United States and elsewhere. There was a wave of protests a few years ago regarding Tsai's protest to Tsai's apology to Taiwanese indigenous on behalf of the ROC state, and particularly that was centered around the issue of returning indigenous regional territories. Tsai had said that she would do that. She made outreach to indigenous activists. Again, she is herself part indigenous. But then when it came down to it, at the end of the day, what were only returned were traditional territories that were in public control. I mean, they were public lands. They were held by the government. Indigenous land that was in private lands was not returned. And so that was an issue, and there have been protests since then. And so there's an occupation that's been going on for basically 3 years in a park. But the size of that occupation has shrunk massively when compared to previous years. And I think that just Tsai can continue to shrug off this demand. What I mentioned regarding the difference between, let's say, previous generations of the Chinese independence movement and younger generations is particularly I think, visible regarding the indigenous issues. Young people are supportive of indigenous issues. They will advocate for Taiwanese independence, and as well as support indigenous activists that will call for being independent of that Taiwan, which is then independent from China. And this is not viewed as contradictory, pushing for independence from China, but also for indigenous, if they want to be independent from the state that you're pushing for the independence of. And that's something that's quite new. And so there were actually a lot of these progressive young activists that are involved in the Sunflower movement that were also very supportive of this call for returning traditional territory. So oftentimes then too, when you have these 228 massacre commemoration events, the indigenous activists will be invited to talk about their demands and so forth. And I think that's also a very new development.
Thank you. That's really fascinating, and I'm hoping we can keep paying attention to this as it develops.
Absolutely.
So one of the major issues in the Trump administration especially has been this sort of ongoing trade war between the U.S. and China. It's really at the forefront of a lot of our news coverage and political consciousness. And news outlets in the U.S. will often mention Taiwan within their coverage of this, but very few Americans are familiar at all with Taiwan. Can you speak a little bit to why Taiwan is so important in terms of U.S. China politics, and how does this sort of leave behind the way Taiwanese people view themselves in these politics?
Yeah, I think there are a few ways to look at it. I mean, one is political, just that the U.S. did back Chiang Kai-shek for decades and did maintain support for Taiwan as a way to counter China, to have this kind of counter narrative and to have a regional power, and so forth. And it's for similar reasons you have American military presence in Japan and South Korea in bases because of the possible Chinese threat. And this goes back to the Cold War. So I think in that sense, Taiwan has this longer history of being a geopolitical pawn of the U.S., a client state of the U.S., and used as a way to basically promote anti-communism in the region and whatever. But I think also particularly Taiwan is economically important. It's central to global supply chains, particularly regarding semiconductor manufacturing and so forth. And also just you look at a lot of the shipping routes in the Asia Pacific, actually in the maritime regions, just basically for all the countries in the area, they pass very close to Taiwan. And so actually, if China expands its military presence, if it takes over Taiwan, then these trade routes are affected. And so that's another factor. And I think these two things then contribute to Taiwan's importance in the U.S.-China trade war. I think, particularly we've seen the U.S. ramping up support of Taiwan, passing legislation in support of Taiwan, such as the Taipei Act or the Taiwan Travel Act, and proposing the Taiwan Reassurance Act, and selling arms to Taiwan in a massive scale, which has not happened in previous presidential administrations. And then also having these high-profile diplomatic visits to Taiwan from, for example, the Secretary of Health and Human Services or the Undersecretary of State. But it's just used as a way to kind of ramp up tensions to China. Actually, you increase support for Taiwan as a way of showing displeasure for against China in the U.S.-China trade war. But it's actually just using Taiwan again as a geopolitical pawn. And I mean, there are also reports that Trump has just considered, for example, using Taiwan as a bargaining chip in trade negotiations with China for a trade deal with China. John Bolton's tell-all, for example, about his time in the Trump administration mentioned that Trump had actually just compared the size of Taiwan's economy to a pen and the size of China's economy to the desk in the Oval Office, and said, well, why do you care about Taiwan? And, there's implication that Taiwan could end up similar to the Kurds in Syria, for example.
That's really fascinating. And I think this sort of ties into another question I have, which is the US, sort of treats in the context of this trade war and, our own sort of quest for continued economic dominance, will tend to, portray China as this boogeyman while doing a lot of the exact same things that we accuse China of. So how can people in the US who want to support struggles, social struggle in places like Taiwan, do this without following into these sort of US-centric narratives that really just uphold American economic and military interests?
Absolutely. And so I think self-determination for Taiwan means independence of Taiwan, of the US and China. And so I think that's the thing that needs to be focused in on. And I think particularly from the left in America, there is some kind of mistaken perception of Taiwan. There are people that still view Taiwan as this kind of right-wing regime backed by the US. They have this kind of memory loop caught in the Chiang Kai-shek period. But then also you have people that just will then look at Taiwan as just kind of not realize that Taiwan is so vulnerable to America in that sense, just that, America does hold all the cards here and Taiwan just has to go with it. And so I think actually just then just really pushing for Taiwan not to be a man into China, but also not for that to mean just Taiwan being a tool of America, a geopolitical chess piece of America. I think that Taiwan should be more situated then with places caught between China and America in this awkward way, such as Okinawa, for example. I think that's a good example of a place that is also just caught between multiple empires and just has no easy way out. And so I think actually pushing for that that path to self-determination is quite difficult. I think it's good if people can be attentive to that tenuous circumstances. And I think that it's just good to raise awareness of that, particularly because it's all these right-wing actors that then back Taiwan. And I think really seeing progressive or left-wing support for Taiwan, it would be very welcome.
So do you think that, progressive international support for Taiwanese social movements could actually help bolster progressives in Taiwan over the sort of like right-wing tendencies?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's one of those paradoxes too, because young progressive young people in Taiwan then see the people backing them internationally as all these kind of right-wing actors, such as the Trump administration or let's say the Abe administration in Japan. And that becomes very difficult then. And I even just sometimes wonder, I mean, just these Republicans, they're a Google search away from realizing what they're backing. Particularly with Tsai and legalizing gay marriage or so forth and things like that. And so that's just one of those things actually. And that is in itself dangerous for Taiwan. That's these kind of right-wing actors that back it. And it's a paradox that I think a lot of Taiwanese young people have to grapple with, particularly because of the fact that Taiwan has seen stronger U.S. support under the Trump administration compared to the Obama administration and that kind of thing. And so there's concerns then even that a Biden presidency will lead to kind of a reversal of course in which there's not support from America. And that's created a lot of anxiety, particularly around the election.
Yeah, so that leads right into my next question, which is like, as a sort of seat of global empire, the outcome of a US election impacts the whole world. And so I'm just curious, like, how would Biden or Trump's election, we know how it's leaning right now, but by the time this podcast airs, we'll probably either we'll be stuck in like weeks of social unrest or we'll know who the next president is, maybe both. But yeah, so how does the outcome of our election impact Taiwan?
Yeah, so there have been a lot of concerns about that. I think it's interesting because 4 years ago there was such concern about Trump being elected, but then verdicts of Trump started to reverse course after the Trump-Tsai phone call in I think December 2016, after Trump took a phone call from Tsai, which is the first time this kind of thing had happened in decades since 1979. But then with the Biden administration, I think there's concerns that he could not be as supportive of Taiwan or just kind of like back away from the China issue. He would probably depend. I mean, he's a more experienced politician. He'd probably depend more on the traditional Cold War style alliances to try to contain China, and so that could possibly include Taiwan, or it might not. I mean, the Obama administration, for example, rattled the Pan-Green camp, the more independent camp in Taiwan, because in 2011 it indicated publicly that it did not have faith in Tsai Ing-wen, and so Taiwan, they perceived her as a troublemaker, quote unquote, in the region, that she would be pushing for this ideology of Taiwanese independence and that would disrupt the region, and that this would kind of just upset the balance of power that America was trying to maintain in the region. And so this is an example of in which America has tried to block Taiwanese independence rather than back it, because just this disrupts American strategic priorities. And so that's very telling. I mean, I think that particularly pro-independence groups have been sometimes idealizing of the U.S. because it backs Taiwan and is bulwark in terms of security from Chinese invasion. But actually, when it comes down to American interests, America might not be in favor of that either. And so it's very difficult. And I think that there's all been this kind of analysis of what Biden might do when he becomes president, but nobody knows for sure. And just will he actually keep up with the U.S.-China trade war? Will he back away from that? And I think there were concerns, particularly around Biden's son, Hunter Biden, that he had all these ties to China. I mean, a lot of these were later found to be disinformation from conservative political forces, but just that led to some anxiety.
I guess I do have one more question that rose out of this, which is like, how do we collectively as sort of, one of the goals of this podcast is to push for global solidarity and awareness. And how do we collectively like advocate for politics that aren't being dictated by the interests of these two powers, but really by people and their struggles? Do you have any thoughts about that?
It's very difficult because I think particularly, New Bloom was founded with this notion in mind of connecting people's struggles, of connecting social movements rather than relying on state actors. But then people are like, well, what's the point of that? Like, what can actually, banking on social movements do for you rather than states? And so I think it's always just articulating then the power of solidarity, that, solidarity is important, that these are ties that are not bound by self-interest, not bound by just advancing, one nation's national interest versus other nations' national interests. And, diplomacy is just basically all founded on just this kind of self-interest, but solidarity between people's movements is not. And I think also it provides valuable power in terms of struggles, because just knowing that other people around the world support you and your cause and that kind of thing. And so actually just building those ties are very important. But I think that it's always just very difficult articulating that. I think it's often an uphill struggle against people that are just saying, build ties with states, with state actors. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Dason, did you have any last questions before we sign off?
No, Brian, yeah, thank you so much, for coming on to this podcast. We do have a little bit more time. Is there anything like you want to send a message, especially to Americans at this time? I think most of our audience is from the United States and who are very curious about building, I think what Rebecca said, like solidarity between peoples. Is there anything like you want to say to us?
Yeah, I think it's just it's important just that to learn about to try to actually get out of this kind of U.S.-centric narrative, because I think particularly there are places caught between the U.S. and China that don't have really a clear way out, and I think particularly critiques of American imperialism sometimes can actually miss the point, just actually still centering America very much, and not realizing that just a lot of countries just don't have good outcomes between America and China, and just they have to navigate both sides. And so I think sometimes Taiwan it does actually get labeled as right wing, but that just doesn't pay attention that there's these progressive young people that are hoping for support internationally. But just it's for them, it's just they're just caught in this awkward position in which support is coming from just these crazy right wing actors. And so I think just pushing that is very difficult. And I would just encourage people to outreach and learn more and connect.
Thank you so much, Brian. So this concludes our episode of Disperse. Brian, I just wanted to thank you for coming on to our channel. And for our audience members, you can visit us on our Patreon and YouTube channel, and we shall see you soon. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Disperse. We return today with Brian Hioe, the editor of New Bloom magazine. The reason why we're returning today is to discuss and reflect on Biden's election win in the United States presidential election. So Brian Hioe, can you explain to us your analysis on Biden's election win and how that will impact Taiwan?
Yeah, so I think first, one of the important things to note is that there are many in Taiwan who idealize the Trump administration. They view the Trump administration as having benefited Taiwan because there are these quote unquote historic gains for Taiwan, such as arms sales, diplomatic visits by high ranking American government officials, these kind of this strong rhetoric against China and so forth. So then, as a result, there's idealization of Trump. And with the Biden win, there is concern then that Biden would perhaps sell Taiwan out, that he would actually act to benefit China, even these kind of conspiratorial accusations that he was backed by China, and so forth. Particularly Democratic administration are seen as being more friendly to China than Republican administrations that are more antagonistic openly to China. And so there's that. And as well, there actually was a lot of disbelief. There was actually, for some reason, it was quite surprising to people in Taiwan that Trump lost, to some people, despite the fact that Trump presided over the COVID-19 pandemic, that 200,030 are dead. This did not actually occur to people because I think just they're so removed from that in terms of the news cycle. There's sometimes still the view of Trump as a competent leader, which is as unbelievable as it may, it's still how some people see him. And so then there's these accusations against Biden. There are people that are claiming, for example, in the Taiwanese media, that the American media called the election early, and that's why Biden won, that Biden prematurely declared victory, alleging voter fraud, or that CCP efforts at undermining America are behind this win. But I think people have to live with it. And I think that particularly what's interesting to note is that when Trump was elected originally in 2016, there was similar concern that this would be what happened because Taiwan was then banking on Hillary actually to win. And then after the Trump side phone call in December 2016, verdicts of Trump just rapidly inversed. They turned 180 degrees. And there's suddenly this idealization of Trump. And so if Biden does do actions that are perceived as benefiting Taiwan, then I think we'll almost see a similar inversal. That concern will just kind of fade away. Biden, it's a question of what he will do. I think that he will act differently than Trump insofar as he won't act as unilaterally. He will work with other American client states and allies in the region. He will work with the EU, with Japan, and so forth to try to contain China. He's a creature fundamentally of the Cold War, whereas Trump is very protectionist. So he will probably try to get America to join free trade organizations again, possibly rejoin the TPP. He said he will rejoin the WHO on the first day in office. And so his attempt to contain China, I think, will continue because structurally the US and China are headed for a conflict economically, politically, geopolitically. But just the way he will go about it is different. But the question still is that Taiwan may still be left out of its containment strategy under past democratic presidencies, particularly the Obama administration. Despite this kind of pivot to Asia and this attempt to put pressure on China, Taiwan was not put as part of the strategy. But I think that what people in Taiwan have really failed to miss is that this kind of terror of the US selling them out, this terror of this democratic administration coming power and selling them out, this should be actually true of any American president. Trump himself contemplated selling off Taiwan or using it as a bargaining chip in a trade deal with China, same with Hong Kong. And I just think that at the end of the day, that's the fundamental structure by which U.S.-Taiwan relations are operating. Just that the U.S. uses Taiwan as a way to get at China. It is a bargaining chip. It is something that is not that America talks about being an ally of Taiwan, but it's really just for its own purposes that it backs Taiwan. And when push comes to shove, when it's beyond acceptable losses, America will abandon Taiwan or just use it as a bargaining chip. And that's true whether it's been Biden or Trump. And I think that that's what people have failed to realize. People have not learned from 4 years ago. And now there's this concern about Biden that he could potentially sell Taiwan out. Well, that wasn't true no matter who is the president. And so I think that's the case now.
Right. There's a lot of like geopolitics
Absolutely.
here. Right. Do you expect that the Taiwanese people will realize that, okay, Biden is someone who can be worked with and that he may kind of readjust his strategy for the benefit of Taiwan? Is that kind of like something realistically that Taiwanese people expect at this point?
I think that eventually depends on what action he does. If they are perceived as including Taiwan in this kind of strategy to contain China, then people will kind of look at him in a better light.
Mhm.
What's interesting is that actually the independence-leaning Pan-Green camp, the DPP, the party of the Pan-Green camp, and a Democratic presidential administration have never actually coincided at the same time until now.
Mhm.
It's just the way that the kind of turnover has happened, and so there's actually kind of new territory. And so I think that just there's that. But the Democratic Progressive Party, despite being a progressive political party, is more reliant on the Republicans because of their antagonism toward China in terms of foreign policy and alliances.
Right.
So it's actually ironic. I also just always wonder if these Republicans, these Republican conservatives are just like a Google search away from realizing what they're backing in Taiwan sometimes.
Completely.
I mean, Tsai did legalize gay marriage, things like that. So,
Completely.
yeah.
Right. And it was also President Tsai who reached out to Biden. Again, she was one of like the first world leaders to reach out to Biden, similarly what she did in 2016 to Trump. So I think she has like some sort of strategy in mind in relation to Biden, it looks like,
Yeah.
at least.
That's right.
Yeah.
There's the hope that he will repeat the Trump-Tsai phone call, have a Trump-Biden phone call. And so he's had phone calls with, the leader, Moon in South Korea and I can't remember the current Japanese prime minister's name, but with Japanese and Korean leaders, he has had phone calls already. And so the question is then Taiwan, so that's the question. And I think that, yeah, I mean, I think just with the DPP or the KMT, they would actually just try to act as though they're not in favor of any political party. No matter who would have won, they would have congratulated them. And just, I mean, they are kind of making up for lost time because of the fact that it is known they favor the Republican Party more. For example, when Tsai was inaugurated, there's a video showing all these politicians congratulating her, including American politicians, and they gave more airtime to Republicans than Democrats. They actually cut out the airtime, the videos of the Democrats. They shortened that. And so that was a kind of blow to this claim of being bipartisan.
Right. Well, Brian, thank you so much for coming on board again and kind of sharing your insights on the Biden election win. I think, we for the next 4 years, for the rest of the Biden term, we have to kind of wait with bated breath to see how the U.S. president will impact Taiwan. So, thank you for giving your insights.
Yeah, happy to be on again.